I think in the search fund model, the bet is essentially intellectual horsepower over experience, right? You're giving someone the keys to a 2 to 5 million EBITDA business, and you're hoping that their hard work and integrity will be more than the experience of the former CEO of the business.
Hello, everyone. This is The Next Moves, and it's a series of interviews done with people who have built incredible companies and awesome careers. I'm doing it for the simple reason that there are so many moments where I'm sitting in meetings in my job as a recruiter, talking with a CEO or a founder or a member of their team, and they're talking about the choices that they've had in front of them and how they considered them. And then as they made them, the impact and what happened. And I'm just thinking to myself, this is so valuable for people because we all get stuck. And hearing how people plan their next move and the move after that, it can help us make better decisions. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes it feels like people make very logical, calculated decisions. And in all the other times, it feels like they flip a coin. And I think we can learn from both those scenarios and the outcomes they got. So without any further delay, let's talk to my next guest. Rob Cherun started his career at Morgan Stanley and McKinsey, but instead of climbing that ladder, which is laid out for you in a very structured way, he took a leap, raised a search fund, and bought a small video surveillance company and transformed it into stealth monitoring. It was one of North America's leading security tech firms, and it grew to over 1,000 employees and ended up selling to another company for hundreds of millions of dollars. And when you look at Rob, he spent a decade in the trenches building it. I knew him at a moment in time, which was probably one of the hardest times, when he was scaling this and building out both the strategy and the people side of his business. And I helped him do that. And now he's decided to step into the role of investing, helping search fund entrepreneurs find their next business and then partnering with them to create something awesome. So welcome my guest today, Rob Cherun.
Thanks, Joe. Pleasure to be here.
I think where we should always start, which is letting people understand your background and your journey to this point. And you can go back as far as you want to, but I think it's an interesting one. We've talked a few times. I've known you for a few years and I've watched you evolve. And I want people to understand those different stages. So can you just walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, so proud Canadian. And then when I was trying to figure out where to go for undergrad, Western had kind of one of the best business programs called the Richard Ivey School of Business. So got kind of pre-accepted there. And so I ended up at Western for 4 years doing business. And then from there, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I liked numbers. And there was a firm called McKinsey and Company, which seemed to be the best tangible experience you could get out of undergrad, where it was essentially getting to help, call it Fortune 500 companies with some of their largest strategic problems. And you'd get to fly around the globe and work with really smart people and C-suites. So did that for a couple of years out of the Toronto office, but lived in Zurich for 6 months, in San Francisco and other parts of the world. And then from there, I thought, you know what, I've seen how advisory works. And then I decided to get some operational experience. So went to work for the executive office at Morgan Stanley, specifically focused on the restructuring of the wealth management division based out of New York. And that was a ton of fun and a great number of learnings. So did that for a couple of years. Then, I was like, well, I don't know what the pie chart of Rob looks like. So I should probably recalibrate by going to do my MBA, as a lot of insecure overachievers do. And so applied to business schools and ended up going to the Stanford Business School out on the West Coast and had an amazing 2 years. Spent my summer at a hedge fund in New York and then decided, you know what, everyone I look up to is a business owner, entrepreneur. I might as well just go for the risk because the risk is not taking the risk at that point. Yeah. Dad was a pharmacist. Mom was a school teacher. And they always thought it was nuts when I was saying things like, hey, guys, I'm going to not take this hedge fund job that's paying my tuition and willing to pay me all this money to live in a Tribeca loft with a corner office. And instead, I'm just going to make no money and become an entrepreneur. And they were like, why? Yeah. Why don't you want stability?
Yeah. It's interesting when you have a school teacher family, or part of it is one parent, is you end up in a place where you don't fully grasp business, I find. And I say that coming from a family of school teachers, all of us, before I left and I had to go do something entrepreneurial. So watching your father, I don't know if watching him manage that small business was a gift that set your expectations appropriately, or if it was more like, oh God, I don't want that to happen to me. Which one was it?
Well, you know, call it being in a middle class neighborhood in Ottawa. You don't have much, as you said, kind of exposure to business, right? You hear about Corel and Michael Copeland, the big CEO,
Yeah.
or JDS Uniphase and Nortel, but you don't really touch them if you're living in Ottawa. What you do touch is the dentist, the doctor, the government worker, those types of employments. And you hear these terms management consultant and investment banker, and you don't really know what they do. You see Michael Douglas in the movie Wall Street, and you're like, oh, that's pretty sociopathic stuff. But like, you think it's just a movie, and you don't actually understand like what business is. Is it theater? Is it real? Is it right? It's all just theatrical when you're in Ottawa. And so my experience, I had a very good friend named Derek whose parents run a Chinese restaurant, and I had another good friend whose dad was an accountant, and that's what was my experience as a business, right? And so growing up, my neighbor would get the Wall Street Journal, and I would ask him for the day after versions, and so I would collect the Wall Street Journal from him every day. So while kids are reading comic books, nerdy Robbie's reading the Wall Street Journal, trying to get smart on business.
Are you serious? That was what you did?
And I would also go to community events, and I would go to Colonel's Popcorn, pick up big garbage bags full of popcorn, go to the grocery store, pick up cans of drinks, and then sell them at the community events because there's no vendor licenses allowed. So I had like a monopoly, and then no one's going to turn down like a 13-year-old. So I would sell popcorn and drinks at like movie nights or whatever the communities would be holding.
There's a line from one YouTuber, Alex Hermosi, who said the best thing for any business is a starving crowd, right? If you open a hot dog stand where there's a ton of restaurants, you're cooked. But if you open where there's a starving crowd at 4 a.m. coming out of bars, you can do very well. So you had the starving crowd with your popcorn.
That's right. But I also had some other lessons. Like I tried to start one of those bulletin board services. You remember when we used to have modems that would squeak,
Yep.
and so I bought the first class client, and I was kind of building it, and I had two modems set up, and I was 13, 14. And then a big service came into Ottawa with 15 connections and blew me out of the water, right? And then I had a website called cellcompare.ca, CELL. I still own the domain, and it would compare all the cell phone plans in Ontario specifically, and then you could get a link to which provider you would go with, Bell or Rogers or TELUS, and I would get a referral. Then FutureShop came out with their wizard, and I was over in a day. And so I learned very quickly also, you want to have capital and be the big boy. It's hard to play in business being a small player with no capital.
Yeah. And it's timing, right? So someone comes in and does something to you, and then there's a change in the market. So I want to jump ahead a little bit, and maybe not. Actually, let's talk about your MBA because you took a course that changed your life. What was it?
Yeah, my MBA changed my life for a number of reasons. It was, first of all, the network, right? You had in this case, around 300 students from all around the world, from all sorts of industries and disciplines. So you could be like, hey, Matt, what was real estate private equity like? Or, hey, Tom, what was it like to be a tech entrepreneur? Whatever the examples were. And it very quickly allowed me to kind of crystallize what was working and what wasn't working, and how people kind of saw their career paths and why they were kind of trying to pivot or stay in the same career path. In terms of course load, there was a couple of very formative classes. There was a class called Formation of New Ventures that talked a lot about kind of how do you build a new business. There was another one called Managing Growing Enterprises, which was pivotal. And then the last one was a course on entrepreneurship through acquisition, which is exactly what I ended up doing, which is essentially acquiring a business to then run it on behalf of your investors.
And that one, I guess, shaped your thinking and helped you get to where you are now because it gave you what? A map, a path?
Exactly. It gave me the confidence that I could go out to investors and say, hey, I have not much experience, but I'm really hardworking, and I've always kind of got straight A's. And would you like to make a bet on me to go find a business and then give me money to buy it on your behalf, and I'll run it? And that was the bet. And I think what I learned at Stanford specifically was you'd have all these huge entrepreneurs or business leaders come in and speak. And you start realizing they're not that different than us, Joe. It might have been hard work or a little bit more intelligence or right place, right time, but they still put one pant leg on at a time, and they're still human, and they still made a lot of mistakes. So that confidence made me realize, why not just go for it just like they did earlier in their careers? And then at that point, it was, how do I go for it? So I had all these entrepreneurial ideas, but then the opportunity costs are high, right? You're going to raise money, burn it, not sure what's going to go. You have all these other tuition and everything else that's coming. Or do you kind of raise a pool of capital to then search for a business for a couple of years? Then you go back to your investors and you say, hey, here's a traditional cash flowing business. Let's buy it at a good valuation, good market understanding. It's been doing the same thing for the last 30 years. You buy it, it's stable, it produces money already, and now you just build and enhance as opposed to create. And that's what my risk aversion kind of led me to.
I want to build off what you just said, and I want to talk about the search fund model. And if you can help us understand exactly what it is and how popular it was when you started versus what it is now, because I think there's been a significant evolution in that. And I don't think that the people that are listening to this will all know what it is. Without you, I probably wouldn't have known as much about it.
Absolutely. The search fund sounds like a pretty wacky concept when you first hear it. It's a model for acquiring a small established company. And so what it is it's a group of investors providing funding to an entrepreneur, or we like to call them a searcher, to go out and find a business to acquire, manage, and grow. This pool of capital to kind of find this business is typically around 500,000 to 800,000 shared amongst investors. And this typically takes up to 24 months. Once the searcher then buys the business, they're then empowered to take leadership, become CEO, create value through operational improvements, market expansion, strategic changes. They're given a board of governance because they're pretty inexperienced. And that hands-on CEO then typically runs it for 4 to 7 years. And then they exit, capturing about 20 to 30% of the profits at exit. Typically, these kind of structures and deals are around $10 to $30 million size businesses, with about half of it being equity.
And how large was the one that you bought? Like, give us a rundown of your business that you built.
Sure. So I bought a business that was originally called UCIT, UCIT Online Security. It was a video surveillance business doing $5 million in revenue, $2 million of EBITDA, with a 40% 5-year compounding annual growth rate, so fast growing. The entrepreneur name was Sidney Summers. He was living in nearby Mississauga at the time, and he was in his late 30s, had 2 young kids at home, and was wanting support and help. And I came in with my business partner, Eric, and said, why don't we partner, Sid? You can roll over equity. We can kind of grow this thing together. You focus on Toronto sales. And 15 years later, we all have the same relationship to some degree.
Let me understand the evolution of the company from basically the number of people, the geographies it was operating in when you started, and revenue, and then what it ended up being when you left.
The business you see it now called Stealth was about $5 million of revenue when you bought it. It was around 50 employees based in Toronto, focused on construction video surveillance. And so the business model was, we'd go into a construction yard and say, instead of a security guard here at night and weekends, why don't we put up cameras and watch them remotely and save you money, but also have recordings and do video reviews and strobes and talk downs and all sorts of stuff to kind of secure your site. So that was the value prop. And when this construction site's done, we'll take it down and move it to the next construction site. The business within 5 years was kind of across Canada. And then we started entering the US, and we made an acquisition in 2016 into the US. And then by 2019, we were like, okay, it's time to provide liquidity. It's been 8 years for our management, for ourselves, for our investors, and to call it de-risk the business. And so we kind of hired investment bankers. And in that case, we ended up getting a bunch of bids, and we ended up with a private equity fund out of New York, Palo Alto. and they bought 2/3 of the business. So we kept 1/3. We then continued to run it for another 5 years, and then we just sold to a strategic named Garda, which is about 130,000 employees. It's one of those big guard companies you probably see at the airport and whatnot. To kind of fast forward, when we sold the business to Garda, we were doing about 150 million of revenue from the 5. We were at about 2,000 employees from the 50. We were at 40 plus offices from the 1. And we were in 5 countries from 1. So lots of fun scaling and some great learnings, both in strategy, talent management, and capital structure.
Let's talk about those pieces. I want you to think about what you got right in the early years and what you got wrong. And I think people would benefit from understanding what you see as critical when you're going from that, $5 million business to 50. And then the step after that, if you want to. What'd you get right? What'd you get wrong?
What we got right was focus, right? So I'd see a lot of my competitors and they're just generalists in security and they're trying to be everything to everyone. And we're like, nope, we're just video monitoring in construction sites. That's it. We're just going to open up new offices. Boring. No, it's not boring. It's focus. It allows us to become best practice at it, create a center of excellence. It allows employees to have a very clean process, both on the installation, service, and monitoring of the systems, and it allowed us to really refine that product offering. Slowly, over time, we expanded it into commercial industrial applications. So we said, you know what, if we are good with dirty power and internet at construction sites, we're probably good at it at industrial sites, scrap metal yards, storage, apartment buildings, that type of car dealerships. But again, mostly outdoor asset protection in some ways. And that focus allowed us to thrive, right? But it also made us very comfortable saying no. Hey, Rob, I can introduce you to Home Depot. No. Hey, Rob, I can introduce you to TD Bank. No. And so even though you were attracted to call it these shiny objects or potential customers, you knew that it would distract your organization and it wasn't your center of excellence. So that was probably number 1. The second was dream team. The most important thing is you can't do it all, right? That's the biggest problem when I look at buying businesses. The entrepreneur has been maxed out and they don't know how to delegate and they don't know how to hire talent better than them. That's what you have to do. You have to find people better than you, put them into a role, and then let them run it as you check in with them every week. And that's what I did. So I built a dream team. Every year I would gift myself, I'd look at what's Rob doing this year, and I would gift myself those hours by hiring a superstar, and I would continue focusing on what was next broken or opportunity in the business. And that, call it scaling, allowed us to kind of take on more. It allowed us to do acquisitions. It allowed us to expand across North America and across different countries. And without that, call it horsepower on the team, I never would have been able to succeed.
That's excellent. What'd you get wrong?
We got a lot of things wrong. The first and most obvious was we were trying to figure out a technology stack. So at the beginning, you just focus on sales. Then you realize all your processes are broken. So then you clean up all your processes and kind of map out the client journey and try to make that very clean as you're kind of expanding office after office after office. Then you start realizing nothing works on Excel spreadsheets anymore, and everything has to be ERP systems and CRMs and all this kind of mapping tools and stuff that can make your head spin. So you get that figured out. Then you realize that the industry isn't growing at the speed you are, so you have to create all these tools in your products or service offerings to actually call it be the innovator in your space. That's where we first got it wrong. We tried to do it all in-house. We hired 50 tech or tech-related resources, and we tried to build it all. You imagine you're going to be a Silicon Valley tech company. But what you realize is not your core competency. Our core competency was installing and servicing cameras and watching them remotely. And so we pivoted within a few years with our CTO and CIO kind of restructuring to focus on outsourcing. And so we hired teams in other regions, other companies to kind of do that for us. And it was much easier and much more fluid at that point. The other thing we probably got wrong was post-merger integration. I had learned a lot. I had done a lot on this at big firms. It's not Excel sheets. It's not org charts. It's cultural differences, right? And so when you buy a business in Dallas and you have a Toronto business, the people think differently. In Dallas, you have a sign on the door that says no concealed weapons. In Toronto, no one owns a gun, right? In Dallas, it's you might have political events that Canadians don't understand and vice versa. And so we'd make these t-shirts, one team, one dream. Doesn't do anything, Joe. And so what we learned very quickly is you need to respect and honor that and come up with ways that you can kind of bring the businesses together while, call it respecting the differences of kind of how they built their businesses and what they're focused on.
I think that evolution in your thinking requires some mentorship. It's not just you, like you're figuring it out along the way that this isn't working. And then someone finally steps in and says, hey, like I've seen you make this mistake once or twice now. And I'm assuming someone was helping develop you. Like I know that you've invested in developing teams before, but who developed you? Why'd you pick those people? Or were they just given to you?
There's been a few along the way. Specifically, when I think of people who really developed me, it's that a hedge fund manager I worked for the summer of 2009 has always been a thought leader for me, as well as my first engagement manager at McKinsey, who's now like a superstar, C-level executive at a Fortune 500 company. They've kind of always been my, call it, compass when I've had to think big decisions or kind of question, kind of call it, where I am in my career and how I'm performing. The management team as well, I think, is a really good barometer and mentors of mine. Like they brought a lot of expertise that I didn't have. And I felt a lot less lonely in the job by kind of relying on them as I kind of pondered decisions. As soon as we agreed on something, then we all rowed in the same direction, which was critical as well. And so there was no patience for someone disagreeing once we had agreed. The other, mentors of mine were definitely my investors and specifically my board. I think in the search fund model, the bet is essentially intellectual horsepower over experience, right? You're giving someone who's probably around the age of 30 the keys to a 2 to 5 million EBITDA business, and you're hoping that their hard work and integrity will be more than the experience of the former CEO of the business. And you can really bet on that when you have good governance structure around it, specifically a board who's there to talk to the CEO, whether it's about an acquisition or about a talent issue or just about, call it, their mental health. And my board was extremely helpful when it came to pivotal moments in the business or how I thought about key hires or dismissals or kind of where, call it, the next focus was in the business.
So within that, then people are giving you advice and that drives some very tough decisions. And I've talked to you long enough to know that you care a lot about people, and the people that you've hired are individuals sometimes that started with you very early stages. So how do you make those hard people decisions?
They can be very hard. There's always going to be a family culture to every organization. And those connections are what drives it, right? When you think of what keeps you at an organization, it's obviously the work, the money, the benefits, but it's also who your manager is. It's the people you grab lunch with. It's the culture. And so when you disrupt that, it can be really hard on people. And so, as a business is, call it, growing 20, 30% a year, that means every 2 to 3 years, the business is doubling. So if someone had 5 people, within 4 or 5 years, they now have 20 people working for them. And a lot of people can't lift that. And so what do you do about that? And so the most important thing we did was we would look at the silo or the process of and say, is it a people, process, or technology issue? And if we took it down to the people issue, then we would talk to the person and say, what's going on? Here's what we're observing. Here's what you're observing. Okay. Do we want to bifurcate responsibilities? Do we want to demote? Do we want to counsel to leave? And we would kind of work through it with them. And so it allowed us to kind of have that mature conversation in most cases where you could bifurcate responsibilities and kind of keep the person in a great role in a growing organization without overdoing it on them. The the most important thing that you realize is a business is just teams on teams on teams on teams. And so people's like, oh my God, how did you run a 2,000 person organization? I'm like, well, you have your 6 or 7 reports and they have their 6 or 7 reports. And then everyone else you know, but you don't know exactly what they're doing anymore. And so you really know 50 people and what they're doing every day and checking in with those 50 people. But what you need to know is those 50 people are making the hires for the next 50 people below them and also holding them up to the standards and whatnot. And so my role was making sure that those 50 were as many A players as possible. Because I knew that if I hired a B in that role, they would hire a C in their role. And before you know it, that whole process or piece of the org chart is imploding. And so it's pretty easy also to find when those things happen, because that's where all the noise comes from. And so that's some of my learnings there.
Excellent. So Rob, I want to talk about the asset class of search funds. I think that, like I told you before, not everyone's had access to this or thought about it. Can you break it down for us in terms of the returns, the way you look at it, its history, where it's headed now, and anything else you want to develop for us so we understand it better?
Absolutely. So the concept came out of around 1984, out of Harvard and Stanford. And so for the first 30 years, this was really a Harvard and Stanford concept. It was 1 or 2 students a year out of those schools going to a lot of the same, call it entrepreneur investors, and kind of raising capital from them. And then it kind of blew up. Where I was still probably the early days. It was 2010. The search fund concept had not been done in Canada, or maybe 1 or 2 had been done. And I then wrote a microcap opportunity as a thesis for one of my professors on Canada. He said, I'd be your first investor if you want to do one of the first search funds in Canada. And that's where I kind of started the concept, and then found a business partner, and we moved back to Canada. Since then, it's grown as an asset class like a hockey stick. And so there's been about 700 search funds, about 100 now a year, coming from all sorts of MBA programs and mature searchers as well, who are called farther along in their careers. The reason for the attractiveness, I think, is twofold. One is it's been a proven, call it, model of return, both for the entrepreneur and the investor. If you look at the Stanford primer, we're talking about like 35% returns with about a 4.5 times return on invested capital over a 7-year period. And when you look at that compared to some of the other alternative investment classes like real estate or private equity and venture, it's like multiples more attractive. Now, the reason it's not talked a lot about, and the reason why it's not as, call it, known in call it mainstream communication or media, is because it's very small, right? These are small deals with typically high net worth individuals. You can't really raise institutional money because the checks are too small. And so that's why it's kind of stayed in kind of a very niche space. The trend, however, has been that it's growing fast. So if you think of like $3 billion having been invested in searches and search acquired companies from the 80s to the early 2020s, 25% of that was in the last 2 years, about 700 million. And so the reason for that, I think, is succession planning, being taught more in MBA programs, and the success of the asset class from the past, like my outcome and others.
You have all these searchers out executing right now. Where does Stealth sit in terms of its success relative to others?
Stealth was a good success story because we held it for so long and we grew fast. So it was double whammy. When you have a business that's growing organically 20 to 30% a year with its own cash flows, that can yield to a pretty good outcome, right? And so that was kind of the return profile. For example, when we sold to private equity 8 years in, our investors got close to 9 times their money. So I remember calling one of my investors who was a doctor and said, okay, you gave us $100,000. Here's a check for close to $1 million. And he goes, well, what about your fees? And I'm like, that's already been integrated. He's like, I thought this was a write-off. Like, wow. And so that was pretty fun and pretty meaningful for us. And also for our management team, who obviously had great outcomes from it as well. But now think of that now you have a 9X, but you haven't sold. You keep going. It's year 8. Now it's year 13, 14, and we sold again. Well, even if you just tripled, now you're at a 25x. And guess what? I rolled again this time. So in 5 years, another 3x. And before you know it, it says 75x return on the original dollars. And that's where I think the attractiveness of this asset comes from, is the compounding returns over a very long period of time. And so it lends itself to more patient money, people that are focused on culture, people that are focused on long-term building of a business, and not just kind of the flip and dip type people that are out there.
How do you select your great search fund entrepreneur? Like, this can't end up being a complete commercial for what you're doing, but I know that people are going to be coming to you after this and being like, let's talk. But how do you select? Like, let's think of it from a demographic. Let's think of it from an archetype, a persona, and there can be more than one. So let me know. How do you select? What do you look for?
Yeah, this is a hard part, right? Like,
Because it's a
how do you
mix.
select for success?
Yeah.
How do you select a winner? And the problem, Joe, is a lot of the times you meet people, and we've all met these people, super charismatic, shaking hands, kissing babies, and then they have no substance,
No.
and then you meet the introvert who no one really likes, but does all the work behind the scenes. But you're like, well, no one really liked them, so could they corral a team, right? And so it's actually harder than it sounds, and so we look at a multitude of, call it, criteria. As I kind of simplify it to the highest level, it's integrity and hard work, right? That's what it's going to take. It's going to take the humbleness to know if anything goes wrong, you need to talk about it right away and always keep to a high bar, because all you have is your reputation. And then hard work, because running these businesses is not ivory tower work. It's, in my case, installing another camera, getting a bucket truck out there, monitoring the camera overnight, repeat. And that is real work. And that, might involve 1 a.m. nights in QuickBooks trying to figure out where that money went, or it could mean jumping on a flight to meet with that client with an hour's notice. In my business partner's case, he moved out west for 6 months because we lost an installer in Vancouver and a salesperson in Calgary, and the board was like, well, who's moving to the West Coast for 6 months to fix this? It does take real work. When it comes to, call it, resume assessment, education is a big piece of it, right? We want people who have always achieved in life, skill sets, personal qualities, financial acumen, right? It's important to kind of understand numbers and feel comfortable with dashboarding and whatnot. And then it's, strategic vision and operational expertise. But a lot of that you can kind of learn on the job. So what we're looking for is someone who's kind of shown success and a track record as they've kind of built their career, and that you would kind of, quote unquote, bet on.
Okay.
What you definitely don't want is ego. So I can't tell you how many times we meet these like prep school kids who went to private school, went to all the right places. These people are no good. Like, well, they're good at maybe bulge bracket stuff. But when you're running a small business, you have to worry about sharing a room. Like, I shared a room with Eric for 14 years, and we asked all of our employees to share rooms. Or when you rent the car, you are typing in the discount codes, right? Because it feels like your own money, and you want your employees to feel like that. And sometimes these pedigreed people don't have the same street smarts or scrappiness that it takes. And that's who you're competing with.
I think that comment's going to resonate with a whole host of people. When you look at your partners that you've worked with and you think about the start of it all and how you selected Eric to work with, how did that happen?
Yeah, you look back and you're like, wow, I was so naive in this decision making, and it worked out. But, Eric, so I was looking for a business partner as I was kind of building on this investment thesis in my second year at Stanford. And I was talking to recruiters in Toronto. I was talking to the Harvard and Wharton clubs for Canadians. And I was just trying to figure out if I could find someone to work on this with, because I'm a high extrovert. So I knew that it would be much more, call it, higher success rate for me to find someone to work with every day. McKinsey friend of mine and a Blackstone friend of mine, so called two reputable sources, introduced me to Eric, who is living in LA, having come from Canada, having gone to the same Ivy School of Business, having gone to New York for banking and then private equity in LA. And we got to know each other. And I remember meeting him, and he's, in a convertible with an Ed Hardy shirt. And I'm like, is this my guy? Like, I'm a bit nerdy. Like, I wear the collared shirt underneath, like the white shirt underneath. And in the end, what I realized is that, call it difference, is what actually made it so magical. And so my skills were different than his skills. And he was an all-star salesperson, and he could make anyone like him. And he loved people. And so we agreed, you know what? Why don't you become president and chief revenue officer? I'll be the CEO of the business. You grow the business 20, 30% a year, and I'll pick up the pieces. And that's what we did for the 14-year journey. And it was amazing because it allowed that partnership to really trust each other and really take on different roles. And so we were very rarely in the same meetings, and we kind of just trusted the other person's work streams, and it worked really well.
So we've covered off how this started, the choices you had to make, all the moves that you made, and how you thought through the different options. I think the big thing that I like to know is what is next, and what are you doing now, and what do you plan on doing?
It's very complicated, Joe. When you run a business, it becomes your identity. So I was running around 3 weeks a month, flying around to our 40 plus offices. I was still single, dating a lot, based in New York City, trying to figure out my life. Had a dog named Cucumber, so I was like, at least I have some semblance of stability. But it was anything but stable or healthy. And you start to become, almost like out of body, in that you wake up, I had an EA, a PA, a chief of staff. So you have 3 people dedicated to just making sure your day is easy. And that means you have your 12 Zooms scheduled, you have your smoothie waiting for you, your dog's being walked, you've never been to a grocery store in 5 years. Like, your life is now taken care of. You don't know where you're flying to tomorrow, but you're flying somewhere. And you think it's epic, but what you realize is you're just on a treadmill at that point. And 12 years in, I worked with the board, and we agreed that we'd bring in, call it exec chair, who had taken Apollo public with ADT, or ADT public with Apollo, I'm sorry. And so we agreed on a 2-year transition. So I started transitioning out of the CEO role. And before you know it, you're not getting 500 emails a day. You're not getting 12 Zooms a day. And you become irrelevant, basically overnight. And you tell a joke and no one laughs because you're not actually funny. It's just people laugh because you're the CEO. And you're like, now what? Right? And then you pick up your dog poop and you're like, this is kind of miserable, but kind of meaningful. Right? And then you go to the grocery store and you're like, I don't know what type of onion to buy for this salad. And all these things happened to me like super late in my life, like at 40, right? And that is what people sometimes forget, is like, you might be epic professionally, but then everything else could be a disaster or the opposite. To find that balance is actually really hard. And so for the first 6 months, I kind of just decompressed, and I was like, okay, I'm not allowing myself to jump into anything, because the first thing an overachiever does is they try to overachieve. That's what I've learned. You're good at this, just jump into something new. All these people are bringing you ideas. You're good at it. You want to have the inertia. You found meaning in what you were doing. You don't know what to tell people. Are you on sabbatical? Are you retired? Are you like on the board of a business? Like, you start running, you have no idea how to explain this. And the whole thing gets a little bit uncomfortable. And so one of my good friends, who unfortunately was very sick with cancer and has passed away since, which has been really hard on, call it group of friends. He spent a lot of time with me talking through how he was looking at the last couple of years of his life. And he had read this book called Designing Your Life. It's a blue covered book from Stanford. And it was really helpful for me as well, where it allowed me to kind of think about how to bifurcate the next few months, how to think about my next goals, what's the next mountain I want to climb. It's probably not achievement in business. And so what does that mean? Well, it means if I want to get married and have a family, I better get that figured out. It means if I want to learn how to make a salad properly with the right onion, I better get that figured out. If I want to surf, which I've always talked about, well, get it done. If I want to learn Italian, get it done. Like, what am I waiting for? And so I told myself, you know what? I'm going to give myself time to do those things. And I'm now happily engaged, getting married this summer. Met the most awesome girl. It's been 2 years now. I've become a decent surfer, decent Italian, and it's been an amazing journey. Now, professionally, you still want to have meaning and you still want to make a dent in the world. And so I started investing. And I invested in search fund entrepreneurs, similar to what I had done. And then I invested in more, and more were coming at me because I had had such a long-term successful journey. And before you know it, friends of mine were saying, well, we'd love to invest with you if you'd be up for it. So I took their money, and before you know it, I have a fund investing in search fund entrepreneurs and helping them grow their businesses. And so that's what I've been doing now professionally for about a year now. And I've been having a ton of fun. It allows me to engage, work with them on boards, work with them on offsites, help them think about growing their businesses, while allowing me to have a little bit more balance, than when I was running a multi-thousand person business.
Like now you're looking at people and you're evaluating them, and you're not just evaluating them, like you really do want to help. I've been a part of this process with you for something recently, and you're doing your best to coach people and frame problems properly, which is the battle that we all face, which is what problem do we have and what problem are we solving, and what's the fastest way to solve it so it doesn't come back and rear its ugly head again, and pulling entrepreneurs out of that. So I think it's awesome. Rob, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, likewise, Joe.
So this has been The Next Moves, and we're planning for not just your next move, but the one after that and the one after that. And I think, Rob, you gave us some awesome insight into your choices, and it's going to help us all make better moves.
Thanks, Joe. Much appreciated.